welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Ahmed and
Jayden Garcia.
How's the start of your week going so far?
It's been good, man. It's busy.
Yeah.
Maybe we can kind of talk about how things are going for you, because I'm super intrigued to hear. Could be a good chit chat to start the episode off. I'm very interested to hear an update on things from you.
Sounds good. Yeah, we can definitely do that. And then segue into just like timing tips and tricks on test day.
Yeah.
And how to use like the little intro sort of 10-minute window that you get, and then some of those lesser known like 2-minute windows that you have at the start of every section. But family's good. Everything's good on your end?
Yeah, man. No complaints. Things are good. Staying busy.
Yeah.
Like all of us are,
Yeah.
Real quick, as far as do you think it'd be worthwhile to have us kind of share our test day experience and what it was like at the beginning, and then kind of go into some, those things you were talking about?
Yeah. I think
I'm sure mine wasn't entirely smooth all the way, but I think hearing how these actually go down, I think is helpful.
Yeah. I think just like what to expect as a first-time test taker, and things that you can do to make test day better, not necessarily from a studying standpoint, but from a logistical standpoint.
Yeah, it's so much logistical, right? So
yeah, definitely. Sweet. Yeah, sounds good.
Let's do it, man.
Good to go?
Ready.
Right. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with Ahmed and Jayden. Today, we're going to be looking at the logistics of test day and how we can optimize that a little bit, and to the best of our ability, reduce nerves, anxiety, and ultimately lay the foundation for a successful day on test day. Before we get into that, Jayden, life of a resident and a family man, how are things going on your end?
It's going well, Ahmed. I'm currently in the surgical ICU. I think it's a great place for learning. These patients are really, really sick. And to be honest, this last month, we work like 30-hour shifts. And despite it being very busy, I'm not sure I've seen somewhere else in the hospital that uses like even MCAT principles as much as in the surgical ICU.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's left and right, things that you were learning in chemistry and biochemistry and physics and all that are used in the ICU. You're talking about ventilators and how air flows through tubes, down somebody's windpipe and into their lungs. And you're talking about vasopressors and how those impact, and acid-base status. And it's just a remarkable place, I think, to learn. I think every medical student, all the pre-meds listening out there, should try and spend time in the ICU. That's really where you put a lot of your knowledge to the test, and it's a really great opportunity to learn. So I've been having a lot of fun.
That's great to hear. And just to clarify, spend time in the ICU as a student, not as a patient.
Correct. Absolutely. Try and avoid that place at all possible as a patient. For students, it's great learning.
It's an impressive operation. Like I remember when my sister was born, my mom ended up in the ICU, and just the collaborative effort and the communication on all fronts, and just how fast paced the ICU can be. I can only imagine how it can prepare you for maybe less urgent areas of medicine where, once you experience the ICU, maybe other branches of medicine aren't as intimidating, maybe.
Exactly. I mean, most people in the hospital have like one problem going on when they're not in the ICU. These other people have 20 problems going on, and you're thinking about all of them at once. So it's a great place to also learn efficiency. As you mentioned, very fast pace, fast pace. So
definitely.
Yeah, man. What's the update with you? Almost med school around the corner. So here, what's the news? Anything?
So, for those that don't know, I applied to an unorthodox number of schools on the low end. I only applied to 8 medical schools.
Woo.
4 in the US, 4 in Canada.
Mhm.
I ended up doing decently well in terms of interview conversion. I was 50%, so happy with that. Um, 2 for 4 on both sides of the border, so no difference there, which I thought was interesting. I've heard back from both American schools that I interviewed at. I'm on both waitlists, and Canadian schools, at least the Ontario schools, all of them get back to applicants on May 14th. And so May is going to
Big
be
day
an
coming up.
interesting month for me in terms of wait lists and hearing back from the Ontario schools. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I like the excitement of it, I guess. Ultimately, as long as I go 1 for 4 or better from an admission standpoint, I'm thrilled and grateful. But yeah, excited to see what happens. And I think, you know, in a sort of serendipitous way, things will work out the way they should. And I still have one final interview left. Basically, one of the 4 schools that I interviewed at has a 2-step interview process. And so I made it to
Yeah.
the second step. That's actually this coming Sunday. And then after that, it's sort of radio silence until May.
Oh
So,
my goodness. May is going to be so anxiety provoking, but I also feel with just how stellar you are as a person, a very exciting time for you. A lot of people don't realize, and I hope our listeners understand that some of the best applicants, at least from Canada, applying to the United States, a lot of schools will hold applicants, even though they're the best, on a wait list, even though they intend on accepting them.
oh,
So
interesting.
a lot of Canadian applicants who are applying to the United States that I have coached over the years have had a waitlist spot that they ultimately secured, and the schools let them know that they were planning on taking them from the beginning. It's just a logistical consideration.
Gotcha. Good to know. That's encouraging. Which is interesting. One of the 2 schools that I got waitlisted at, and this is just a complete aside, the turnaround time from my secondary getting submitted to getting invited for an interview was like impressively quick. Like
That's
36
always
hours,
upside.
36 hours quick, which I like refreshed it a couple of times. Like, there's no way. Like, I submitted this like 2 nights ago. But in
Right.
any case, on the note of efficiency and sort of in line with what we were talking about with the ICU, how if you experience something super fast paced and frantic, when things slow down, it really does feel different. How that is somewhat analogous to testing. Like I remember in high school and college playing football, playing quarterback, I always thought like the speed of the game was very, very fast. And
Right.
like we'd be going over things in film study and a coach would be like, hey, like, why didn't you see that? Dude, like things are going so fast. Like, I don't know. And I felt something somewhat similar prepping for the MCAT. Like I remember, and disclaimer, I took the MCAT twice, with the second attempt being to improve my car score and to be a little bit more competitive in Canada. And I remember the first time walking into the test center, it just, the formality of everything. Like you're
Right.
palm scanning and they're inspecting your glasses, not just when you go in, but when you go out and when you go back in and when you come back out. It's like, what am I at Fort Knox? Like, I think that just that process of feeling sped up, even in the breaks, right? Like you always have to account for, well, it's 10 minutes until the next section starts, which means it's 8 minutes until I need to get up and move back to the room. And if there's a
Mhm.
line or, you always, as an applicant and as an examinee on test day, anticipate worst case scenarios.
Exactly.
And the goal of today's episode is going to be what things can you do to just find calm and find confidence from a logistical standpoint on test day. And so, Jayden, starting with you, what was your test day experience like? I know it wasn't necessarily the smoothest experience.
Yeah, and I think you hit it right on the head, Ahmed. You have to prepare for the unlikely scenarios, for the imperfect scenarios. And, I showed up to test day, and you're supposed to arrive with a set of documentation that allows
Right.
you into the test. And I had looked over the paperwork 5, 6 times, and I was told I needed one ID card. And I showed up, and the person was brand new working the testing that day, and they told me I needed two. So instantly, I'm freaking out. Turns out I only needed one, but because this person was new, it was very confusing. But you can imagine my heart rate's very high at this time.
Yeah.
And then I started the exam. This new person also didn't give me a whiteboard to do any sort of note taking. So my Chem Phys section's going. I have no whiteboard. I had to raise my hand. He was not attending to me. I ended up getting my whiteboard, was able to get back on track with a lot of deep breathing. And after the first section, cars is right after, and immediately your time starts ticking as far as your breaks go. And he was not coming to get me. And you can't leave the testing center to take your break until somebody escorts you. And so it was just a mess at the beginning. This new guy was trying to figure out how to do this. But I think, it's a testament, like, you have to prepare under less than ideal conditions if you want to perform under less than ideal conditions.
Right.
And, I had taken lots of tests in noisy places, which I recommend, just to prepare me for some of these mishaps that naturally happen.
Right.
And obviously the test went well, but there are a lot of things throughout that could have really derailed my confidence. Of course, there were specific items on the test that freaked me out a little bit, but you have to take a step back and realize I've been here before. And I think the point of this whole conversation that you and I are going to have here for our listeners is, how can you make this as muscle memory as possible so that you don't freak out under less than ideal conditions? And so ultimately, I got back on track. Things started to go much smoother, but there was a lot of potential for disaster at the beginning. And so that was ultimately kind of my experience. I'm interested to hear how smooth or not smooth yours went.
Yeah. And, just building off what you said about replicating test day as best as possible, wanting to replicate those less than ideal scenarios, because ultimately it kind of ties into this principle of overload, right? Like, you get used to something being more difficult or as difficult as the quote unquote competition or the actual event, and it just makes the actual event so much easier, at least relatively, which can help build confidence. For me, it was interesting because, as I mentioned, I took the MCAT twice, once during COVID and once somewhat post COVID. So September 2021, August 2022 were my two test dates. The first one, I was on a million wait lists. It felt like forever because they had canceled so many test dates in Canada, just with the pandemic. And so they had and I'm not sure if they did this in the US as well, but there was a time where they shortened the MCAT exam from 7 hours of seated time to, I think, 5 and change. A good friend of mine actually took the shortened version of the MCAT. And so I took 2 normal length exams both times. But what was interesting was that because of the pandemic, they doubled up on slots each day. So they had an 8 a.m. slot and they had a 3 p.m. slot. And so my first attempt was in that 3 p.m. slot. And I remember, getting there, I was able to go to the venue day of. I didn't go to the venue prior because it was about 50 to 55 minutes away, just because at least in Ontario where I live, I'm in a small city, like an hour away from Toronto, an hour away from another test center. So there's nothing really in my area. So first time going to the venue, the actual check-in process was fairly smooth, both times actually. I didn't really have any major obstacles or anything like that, but I remember leaving or finishing that 3 p.m. exam. It was like maybe 10, 15-ish, and I remember just sitting in my car for 15, 20 minutes, just regrouping and like trying to bring myself to drive home. And I found it interesting that the morning exam my second time, the evening or afternoon evening exam the first time. I'm not really a morning person, but I actually prefer the 8 a.m. exam because like
Right.
you feel so depleted, especially when it's later in the evening like that. But yeah, as far as like the logistics of like checking in, ID, locker, whiteboard, I know some students mentioned having, somebody coughing or some disruption in their sort of aisle on test day. I was very, very fortunate not to have any of that. And I remember even back when I took the SAT, you don't have earphones, you don't have cubicles, you're in this big room, like a classroom with like 25 other people. I remember when I took the SAT, there was a kid just coughing up a storm. And,
So,
and I was just like, you could have stayed home. Right. But, no, I can imagine how disruptive it would have been to have, somebody coughing or to not have, a whiteboard where like you kind of need it in Chem Phys sometimes to be able to do some of the math or just to visualize equations. And, I would also think in your situation there, Jayden, like there's got to be an element of, okay, like I've been dealt a less than ideal hand. There's and I'd be interested to look into this, but there's possibly something in the way of, communicating that to the AAMC, hey, like I wasn't given a whiteboard. I had a completely new proctor that wasn't escorting me on time, and they are camera monitored. So like there would be evidence for that. I guess the message I'm trying to convey there is like, if you as an examinee, and this is all of our listeners as well, are truly dealt like circumstances that are non-ideal, beyond your control, and directly impact the performance on your exam, you can almost take comfort in knowing, okay, there's likely a procedure or protocol in place where I can report my experience and something can be done to remedy that situation.
right.
But yeah, I've
And it's
never gone down that road myself, but I think what we'd love to really address is what are the things that we can control? What are the things that help us in our experiences be successful from a logistical standpoint? Obviously, preparation for the exam itself is a different story, but what are your thoughts on, for example, checking out the test venue in advance of test day? I know that's something a lot of my students have done, especially those that live closer to their test site, or in more extreme cases, students that are traveling to a test site and get there a day early, staying in a hotel near their test site, a little bit more economical, we'll say, to go and check it out. But in general, thoughts on that as a practice?
I've told my students over the years, always try and evaluate the test site if possible. You mentioned some very important logistical limitations. There are financial limitations if you're staying in a hotel. That is 100% understandable. But if it is within your reach of doing it, it's one less thing that could cause extra anxiety that can throw you off, right?
100%.
I've always taught that this experience should be a muscle memory one.
Right.
Yes, you have to think through the intricacies of the exam, but the process and how you go about taking the exam and completing it should feel familiar in almost every way. And there's nothing worse than prior to starting the exam, you're in traffic because you didn't do your research on how long it might take to get there, right? If you're taking in a bigger city you're unfamiliar with, you're lost because you put in the wrong address. All of these things can start you off so poorly. And the first quarter is just as important as the fourth. And I'm a huge fan of that if you can. If you can't, you should take the extra time to at least look up what it looks like on Google Maps. You should call ahead of time to see if there's any odd protocols. Some of these testing centers don't all function the same. I learned most recently for my step 3 exam that if you show up early, they'll let you come in, and that way you can be one of the first ones to test, so that you have less people there while you're testing, and you can get out breaks quicker. Like, there are things that each test centers treats differently. So I think it's important to find out as much as you possibly can before the test takes place. So
I echo that. Like, a student of mine over the summer visited his test center the day before and found out that the main floor bathroom was out of order. And so the bathroom of it, like in use, was actually downstairs. And so, when you're not in the test sort of atmosphere, you might think to yourself, okay, that's a minor inconvenience. I'll walk downstairs. It'll be fine. You're going to walk downstairs panicking because you don't know where downstairs the bathroom is. You have to take an extra 30 seconds to walk downstairs, an extra 30 seconds to walk back upstairs. That's a minute of your break that you're now stripped of. And it's another element of uncertainty. And it's the thing that I try to relay to students is it's like, no one issue, no one event or obstacle is going to crush or break you on test day. It's the summation of test day pressure and one minor thing here and one minor thing there, and your shirt's itchy and you got a little bit thirsty after question 34, and it's a sum of a bunch of little things. And so I think, like you said, Jayden, one of the best, like, if possible, it's a great practice to just go see the test site, just, walk around, visualize positive outcomes on test day, just going through the motions and making it muscle memory, like you said, seeing where you're going to check in, where the line's going to form. I remember my first attempt, I kept trying to pull a door that said push, and I was like, oh man, like, it's going to be one of those days. Just little things like that. And it's just like, if you can create a positive snowball effect where, you're building, all right, yeah, we're good. You're building a rhythm. That's powerful. And I'm curious, besides going to the test site the day before, what are some other logistical tips and tricks that you can think of, whether it's managing timing or, getting to the test site, or what to do on breaks? Like, what are some of the things that helped you get through the rest of test day and ultimately perform well?
Yeah, and I always like to talk big principles because everybody approaches a standardized test differently, right? Some of my nuances of how I approached it may not be appropriate for someone else. But what I think stands true is taking out as many of those little things that you were mentioning. So I would tell my students, we've already kind of covered the testing in non-ideal test conditions because you might get that. So I recommend testing in a busy library where you might hear people talking. I would eat the same food on practice days that I was going to eat the day of, right? The last thing you need is to try the scrambled eggs the day of, and now your stomach's hurting, right? You mentioned it. It's a snowball, and it can either be a positive or a negative snowball. I wore the exact same clothes every single time I tested because I didn't want anything to feel different. I listened to the same music the day of. I had a routine. I knew exactly when I was waking up. That's something I see students do all the time. They wake up at noon most of their time preparing for the test, and then test day they wake up at 6. That's different, and your body's going to notice it. You have to try and blend in as much as possible.
Yeah.
And so I would think about that routine from the second you wake up, actually, when you go to bed the night before, to the second you hit like, okay, I'm ready to take this test on the software.
Right.
And everything should be the same. Everything. That really will help those with test anxiety. And we know that students can be scoring in the 520s and then on test day score 502 because they totally blow it in this regard. It feels so foreign to them, right? You talked about testing in the afternoon versus morning. I see people taking practice tests starting at 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. most of the time, and then their actual test is starting at 7. Like,
Yeah.
you can't do that and expect to perform. I think we learn so much from athletes, right? Athletes go through the same motions all the time so that when they're in the game, they're not thinking about it. It's just reflexive.
Right.
Like, I literally have this video. I recommend everybody watch it. Type in Google Michael Jordan in practice. And it's like 4 minutes, and it's about Michael Jordan saying, I was never scared about what I could or could not do because I knew going in what I was capable and not capable of doing. And that's exactly how the test should feel. Don't take the test too early. Make sure your test is, you are ready for this test, because you're not going to see surprises in a good way. Rarely have I ever seen somebody, scoring 502, knock out a 512 plus. That just doesn't happen. If anything, it's somebody who has a choking episode because they're not doing the things we're talking about. And so that's the first thing I'd start with. I don't know if you have any comments. I think timing is a whole other thing we'll discuss, because that can ruin a test faster than anything. But any comments, Ahmed, from your experience on, trying to take out those little things to make this possible?
I fully second the food side of things. Like, for me, I'm a big pop guy. And so I had 2 little mini cans of like Sprite and Pepsi, and like I just had one on each of my 10-minute breaks. And I just just things that are gonna keep you going. And like it sounds silly, but like have some low-hanging fruit for yourself to look forward to on the next break. Like it's simple, but like I sort of had 3 different, I guess, groups of snacks, we'll say. Like I had like one little group on the first 10-minute break, and then like a bigger sort of sandwich type of thing, and then another little snack, just like, hey, finish this section and you can go, you get, insert your favorite snack here. And and I think, but yeah, like don't change your nutrition too significantly. Like if you're a caffeine person, have something caffeinated in your lunch, right? If you're not a spicy food person, not really a good idea to go with tamales, right? Like
right before,
And I think other logistical considerations, if you're a superstitious person, then by all means be superstitious. Wear the same clothes, listen to the same music. For me, it was more so about like, how can I feel energized during testing? And so what that brings me to is the 2 different times that I tested. One was an 8 a.m., one was at 3 p.m. If you have to commute more than 45 minutes to your test center and you're, able, I would encourage you to stay in a hotel just within a 5-minute walk or 5-minute drive of your test site, because then you can get this calm of checking into the hotel 4 p.m. the day before. Hotel has a pool. You can go for a swim, for a hot tub. Student of mine's testing on Friday, booked a spa day at her hotel on Thursday. Like, you can do things to get yourself in this calm, positive sense of mind. And building off of what you said earlier, Jayden, like that manifestation of success on test day doesn't start the morning up. It starts the day or even 2 days prior, where mentally you're starting this positive visualization, this positive just expectation. And I think my second time, knowing that I'm not a morning person, staying in the hotel was actually big for me. Didn't have to make breakfast. Breakfast was included. I was able to pack some stuff from breakfast, take with me. It removed one variable, right? And that's been a common thing we've been talking about. I didn't have to make breakfast. I didn't have to worry about drive. I was in a good routine. And I think the other logistical thing I can think of is just get comfortable going through some of the check-in, check-out stuff. Like, get comfortable. Yep, you can scan my palm, right? Do that, like simulate that in test day, right? Show your ID everywhere. Have your ID sitting next to you. Just like you said, making this as much of muscle memory as possible and just embracing it, right? Like, if you can simulate something as authentically as possible and perform well, no reason to expect anything different. But naturally, human nature sometimes can get the best of us. But building off the quote or the video you mentioned there, Jayden, one of my favorite quotes of all time that helped me get over performance anxiety in sport. Full transparency, I was never, and I shouldn't say never, rarely did I have bad testing anxiety, but I had bad performance anxiety when it came to playing football, just because, you're always performing at the center of attention, right, as a quarterback. And sometimes there's big crowds and sometimes there's away crowds. And, you hear things that in an ideal world you don't hear, but it's the nature of competitive sport. And one of the quotes that an old coach gave me was, confidence is born out of demonstrated ability. And it was originally from Bill Parcells, who's a legendary coach for the Cowboys way back when. And it's just something that stuck with me, right? And it's simple, but like, if you've done something before, you can be confident that you can do it again, right? And I think it's such an underrated principle, obviously on the MCAT, but in life in general, right? Like, for whatever reason, I think this generation is a little bit more timid or lacking in confidence, for lack of a better word, in the sense that, like, there's always this fear, this hesitation, and there's not much of a, no, like, I can do this, that go-getter type of mentality. And that's, I think, the biggest piece of advice I would give somebody going into test day from a mental standpoint is, if you've prepared and you've gotten the results in practice that you're hoping to get on test day, then knock it out of the park. Like, you're able. Now, like you mentioned, if you take that test too early and you've been getting 504 or 510, like some number, if you're below your target score, right? If your target score is 520 and you're consistently at 514, or you're aiming for 510 and you're consistently at 505, we haven't demonstrated that ability yet, right? And so confidence is harder to come by there. But I think the two biggest things for me anyway were that quote and, just like you mentioned, the routine of, yep, all right, I've got my snacks, I've got my juice and pop of choice. I'm in an environment that's as close to home as possible, right? That's one other thing I'd mention is, we always talk about make your practice as much or as similar to test day as possible. But the day of the test, that kind of goes the other way, where you can make that testing environment as close to your normal at home as possible, right? By having the same food and having the same clothes or the same music. And it puts you in a space that can feel like home, right? And the last thing I'll mention on that note, on the note of music specifically, music's powerful. Like, music can take you back decades even, right? Like, I'm sure we can all relate to, you hear a particular throwback hit on the radio and it just takes you back to elementary school or middle school. And it's not just that it takes you back to a time, it takes you back to a group of people, and it takes you back to a place. Like, anytime I hear a replay by Tayo Cruz, I'm in 5th grade on the bus ride home, like without fail. And you can leverage that in your prep. Like, if you're listening to the same song before, or the same playlist going into every practice test, you can leverage that come test day and just put yourself in that positive space.
I totally agree. I think placing yourself in the right mindset, at least up until the exam, is so key to start your performance the right way. What I think is also important that we discuss is you are going to see curveballs on this test.
Yeah.
So as much as Ahmed and I are trying to convey the message of preparation beforehand and trying to create a routine that is exactly what you're going to do on test day will set you up for success, you also have to understand that there will be some curveballs thrown your way. One of my tutors for the MCAT scored a 522, and he started off his chem phys exam, and the first question asked him about something about an anion, and he had such a blank for about 2 minutes. He could not remember what an anion was. And that happens, people listening. You may draw blanks. What he ended up doing is what I recommend to everybody: taking a step back, checking your own pulse, recognizing that you can recover, and not letting one question derail your entire test. So
Absolutely.
as much as we can prepare you for, you know, up to the beginning of the exam, just know in the exam, you may see some of these things, but you should practice going through a routine in your head of what you do when you come to these stumbling blocks so that it doesn't throw you off. One of the recommendations I have is, I think students who are so close to time elapsing when they finish sections tend to struggle with this most, because they have no margin, right? If you're going to have a 2-minute brain fart and you always finish sections with 10 seconds to go, you're in trouble. Now, some people do really well just finishing at the wire, but you have to ask yourself, who are you? And so I generally tell my students, try and finish with like 5 to 8 minutes if you can. That will allow some wiggle room on test day. And the other thing I'll add before I toss it back to you, Ahmed, is recognizing that a poor timing problem is a snowball effect. You screw up the first passage because you're second guessing yourself. So really, muscle memory, trust your gut and move forward. But also, provide yourself with enough time to recover in case you get lost in this rut. And it's okay to skip a passage if you have to, if you're so flustered, so that you stay on time to be able to go back under calmer circumstances at the end once you finish things. You'll be so much more prepared to answer those questions because you're no longer under the gun timing wise.
Yeah.
What are your comments?
Well, I relate to the story of your tutor. Like my strength was always math. Like growing up, just for context, like I moved to the U.S. From Egypt with my family as a young kid, and so there's always, not always, but for a while there was a language gap and there was a cultural gap. But numbers are universal, and so I always did well in math class, but English was a different story. But like as a kid, I had this affinity for math because it was the only thing that I could do as well, if not better, than my peers. And so going into the MCAT, Chem Phys being first was in my best interest because it was my best section and it was first. Very first question was a math question of my second attempt. And I did the math. Awesome. Looked, not there. And I'm like, ain't no way. And I'm like, I'm trying to troubleshoot and I'm drawing a blank. I look at the next question. It's a laser question with wavelengths and stuff. Great. But like, I'm drawing a blank. I'm like, is blue 700 nanometers or is it 400 nanometers? Like, I can't. I'm like, not this again. And so I ended up skipping the entire first passage, looked at the second passage. I was like, not now. I'm like, listen, give me some discrete questions. Let me just breathe for a second. Mm-hmm. Got 4 discretes in a row. Quick. I'm like, all right. Settled in a little bit. Did the next passage. Fine. I'm like, okay. And at this point, it's only been like 10 minutes. Like, we're not super deep into the section, but I've only completed 4 discretes and a 4-question passage, having skipped the first 2 passages. So I'm like, listen, I'm ahead of schedule. Let's relax. I went back to the first question. I'm like, listen, I know I'm good at math. Let's figure this out. And I was literally just off by a factor of 10. I'm like, okay. And then you get that one done. It's like, all right, let's handle the rest of this. The wavelength one, I'm like, oh, yeah. Okay, I remember which wavelength and which color to use here. I remember that violet is higher energy, so it's going to be lower wavelength. All right, we're good, right? And then you get into the rest of the passage, because I didn't even see the last two questions for that passage. I'm like, oh, these are very, very doable. And then you actually look at the second passage and it's like, okay, like there was no reason to skip this. Now, I think what I would reflect on is like that sort of punch early on was a blessing in disguise, because I was able to calm myself down, overcome it, and that gave me confidence going into the rest of the exam. But I also second the notion of skipping and going out of order. And the best example of this I can give is from my own experience with cars. I hated cars. Full transparency. Hated cars. It was why I retook the exam. And I ended up improving by 4 points on my second attempt in cars while maintaining or improving elsewhere, because obviously like my understanding of the cars section and looking for arguments and such really helped, but I did passages out of order. And so from my experience with my first attempt and in practice, I came across a recurring theme, which was that out of the 9 passages, typically 6 to 8 of them are very straightforward reads. The questions could be tough, but as far as reading it goes, usually there's between 6 to 8 where I can read it and say, okay, yeah, I understood what that said. Always 1 to 2, 1 to 3 that are a little bit more involved, but I knew I could count on 6 to 8 passages that would be decent reads for me. And so when I came across one of those oddball ones, and I could tell right away from the first 3 sentences, like, okay, this is one of those, I would skip it. So on that test, there were 2 of those that I skipped. So I did 7 in my first run through of the passage or the section. And when I say skip, like I would see those first 3 sentences. If it was 33 to 38, I'm going to 39. Like I'm not looking at the rest of the passage. I'm not looking at the questions. I'm coming back to this later. The 7 passages that I did, though, because they were more straightforward reads and I had a better understanding, I got done in 62 minutes. So a little bit less than 9 minutes a passage, which if we do the math, I had 2 passages left and I had 28 minutes left. So I could have averaged 14 minutes per passage on those last 2, right? And the value in this is threefold. 1, I build confidence by doing those easier passages first. 2, I know exactly how much time I can afford to allocate to those more difficult ones. Because if you do it in real time and you spend 13 minutes on one of them, you're like, oh, shoot, I went over by some amount of time. Whereas for me, if I spent 13 minutes on one of those passages, I'm winning by a minute, right? Like, and the third thing is you improve your accuracy on those easier ones because you're not startled from having done the hard one before it. Right. And like even a fourth thing that I'm thinking of now, on to your point about finishing early. Now, if you don't finish on time, at least you've done the ones that you're likely to do best on first. Right. And the passage that you don't finish very well could have been your lowest score anyway. So the difference between making informed guesses versus actually going through the passage could be a difference of 1 or 2 questions, which could end up being 0 points at the end of the day. And so that was something for me that actually made a really, really big difference, because when I finished that 7th passage, I took a minute or a minute and a half and I just closed my eyes. I just breathed and closed my eyes. And then I could take 13 minutes on each of those last 2 passages and be comfortable. Like if I didn't understand something, I could afford to reread it. If a question was tough, I could afford to debate those last 2 answer choices or to meticulously analyze them, right? And it's something that not many people or not enough people embrace or welcome that idea. And like some of us, we like order, right? Like we don't like moving pieces. We like going through things in order, regardless of what it may be. But I think, if, especially for those that do finish, sort of near the wire, like this is something worth experimenting with. Like obviously we like structure and we like routine, but not at the expense of being stubborn and, limiting performance, right? Because at the end of the day, every single question on this exam is worth the same weight, right? And so get all the easy ones done. And I'll leave it at this. I always tell my students, like the way you're going to improve your score isn't likely by getting more of those very difficult questions correct. It's by getting fewer of those easier ones incorrect.
Correct.
You reduce the number of silly mistakes and you reduce the slice of the pie that is more difficult, which is more for the sciences where you reduce content gaps and such, but just in general, increasing the number of questions that you find easy and increasing your accuracy in them is the recipe for score improvement in my books. Like I've seen students that are like, they'll fixate on specific tough questions and they'll tell me like, these are the questions that I need to get to improve my score. And I'm like, these questions can improve your score, but they'll get 50 out of 59, for example, and it'll be a 129, and they're really hoping to get a 131. There will be 2 questions like that they'll have gotten wrong. And then we'll look at the other 7 and they're simple mistakes. And I'm like, It's not the 2 that hurt you, it's these 7, right? And I think going out of order can help to mitigate that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the big principle that we're highlighting here is extra time on the test can help you think clearer to answer questions correctly and make mistakes much more minimal and less frequent in nature. Yeah. And there's many ways to skin a cat. Ahmed brought up a fantastic way to do that, which is skipping out of order. Something I found very helpful was to limit the amount of time I took on a question. It was always for me 1 minute. There was never a question on the MCAT I spent longer than 1 minute. And if you do that, then you will have an abundance of time at the end where you can calm down. And so I think we're challenging all of the listeners here. If you are somebody finishing at the wire, to take some of these suggestions and implement them in your practice. And this is where I get very nervous when people tell me they're taking a very short amount of time to prepare for this exam. Because the idea is you need a lot of time to tweak these things, to find out what works best for you. So when you take one practice exam and think you're ready to take the test, or you're going to take 2 months or a month or 2 to prepare for this exam, I get very nervous because I think you need these trial and error methods. You might implement Ahmed's, strategy of skipping over cars to find the confidence that you need, and all of a sudden you're going from a 120 in cars to a 127. It could be that simple. I've taken students after one suggestion, one tiny little difference from a 502 to a 515. It was just a little tweak that all of a sudden, to your point, Ahmed, they're scoring much better on the easy questions that they're missing for various reasons.
Right.
And remember that, you only need, you can get a perfect score in a section and still miss some. So
yeah,
remember what Ahmed said about every question is weighted the same. And if you're playing one question that is worth nothing and it derails your whole exam, you should consider skipping over it so that you're not getting the negative snowball effect.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I got to give myself credit. Like that Chem Phys section, I ended up doing exceptionally well. It was the highest score on my exam, and it very easily, from the start of it, could have gone off the rails, right? And so just understanding, guys, and I use this metaphor with students a lot. Think of a bucket, okay? And the size of this bucket depends on the score that you're hoping to get. If you're hoping for a high score, like a very, very high score, this bucket shrinks. This bucket, you put questions in it that you're uncertain of, and you're accounting for them. Like you're going into test day saying, my bucket is yay big, whether it's 4 questions or 7 questions or 10 questions or 15 questions, doesn't matter, right? Fill the bucket. And until you do, don't stress. Right? Because you accounted for this, right? For example, I had a student that wanted a 520. It's a very ambitious score target, but this was their goal and they were capable. And so I said to them, okay, listen, if you want a 520, we're looking at a 130 across the board. Not a guarantee, but on average for Chem Phys, you're looking at 54 is roughly the number of questions you need. For cars, we're looking at 49, 48 if we're lucky. 48 usually gets you a 130, but in any case, bio 53 probably. Psych could actually be a little bit higher. It could be 54 again, right? And so what I tell those students is the number of incorrect questions that you can afford is the size of your bucket. And the reason I say that is because if you fill your bucket, you're not going to get all of them wrong. But the ones that you get right cancel out the easier ones that you expected to get right, but might have gotten wrong. Right? And so just having that, I guess, wiggle room, that buffer, that built-in buffer can really help from a confidence standpoint. And that metaphor actually wasn't something that I used when I was testing, but it's something that I've implemented with my students. And thinking back, I could have said, hey, that's the first question in the bucket, and I've got X minus 1 to go, right? Like, I'm good. And even if you do fill your bucket, that's fine because you're not going to get all of them wrong, right? Like, slight tangent, but it's March, which is March Madness, and so it's bracket filling season. And I always love the data and the stats behind it. And I read something the other day where, on average, if you can get something down to a binary choice, A or B, and it's not a random guess, you are somewhat educated on this field or this topic, you'll average around 2/3. You'll be correct approximately 2/3 of the time. If it's down to 2 options and you're educated on the topic. And so if we apply that to the MCAT, if you can get a question down to 2, which isn't unlikely, oftentimes students can at least get it down to 3 or sometimes down to 2, and you've prepared, you likely have a 2 in 3 chance of making the right decision if you employ an informed strategy, right? And so if somebody has a bucket of 9, they fill it, and say they just go 50%, right? They get 5 out of 9, and they get 48 out of the other 50. That's 53 questions. That's a 130 in all likelihood, right? And I would encourage students to use that bucket metaphor because it can give you some invaluable peace of mind.
I think that's great. And I hope those listening really think about how doable this is if you're willing to put in the work and approach this the right way. And test day can be a very rewarding payoff if you're, eliminating some of those things that can get in your way of success by having a routine, understanding how timing works on the exam and how to maximize that. And all of this is to say that there are things that you control on that day. You control your routine. You control your timing. You don't control what you're going to see, right? You could have prepared hours and hours and hours appropriately for Le Chatelier's principle and titrations, and you may not see it.
Yeah.
But what you are in control of that day when you sit for that exam is your routine beforehand, your timing on the exam. So I think we've covered some very important aspects of how to take control of what you can on that test. And if you do, you take control of those things and you prepare, as we've discussed on this podcast and throughout the curriculum that we offer here at Jack Westin, you're going to be just fine. And you're going to be very happy when you get that score report.
Yeah. And I always sort of bring it back to this for students that really fear test day. This is a choice. This is not a requirement to be a member of society. You have voluntarily chosen to take the MCAT exam. And in all likelihood, it's because of the desire and the commitment to fulfilling your dream of becoming a doctor. And so always just remember that, like, this is a choice that we get to make, right? You don't have to take the MCAT. You get to take the MCAT. And that perspective is everything, because it's something that, and by no fault of any applicant, but like in the heat of preparing for test day, it doesn't feel like a choice, and it certainly doesn't feel like a privilege, right? But we have to remember that it is, right? Like there's countless people, I'm sure, that would love to take the MCAT if they were able, right? If they had the resources to prepare, or if they had, the accessibility. There's a number of barriers, but just always keep that in mind, because, and not to get too deep or anything, but like we can sometimes lose sight of that. And the flip side of that coin is just understand that this is, something that will propel you to a lifelong dream. It's not the only thing, but it's part of it. And so it's ultimately an investment of effort into your future, right? Like, and in the process, you're going to develop skills like perseverance, initiative, resiliency that make for a great doctor, right? So you're getting multiple benefits. Like, obviously you're preparing for this exam, you're learning information that you might see again in med school. Some of it you might not, but some of it you will. But you're also sort of benefiting from this quote unquote hidden curriculum, to throw in a little bit of psych soch there, that there's Latin learning, there's unintended benefits of those character traits that make for a great doctor. And so keep that in mind as you prep. Keep that in mind as you go into the testing center. Pretend that you're walking into the hospital as a doctor, right? And you're keeping that demeanor that's going to inspire those around you, right? Like if you walk into a hospital and you're stressed, how do you think your patients are going to feel, right? Like, so just whatever it takes to put yourself in this space where I'm not only able, but I'm going to be successful. And this is something that I want to do because it's going to lead me somewhere I want to go, can help keep us grounded and ultimately help keep us excited. Because I think one of the biggest things you can do for yourself is have a positive or a happy association with test day, treating it like the culmination of all your hard work as opposed to judgment day, right? And it's just back to your point there, Jayden, those subtle tweaks, and it really can come down to just perspective. But experiment with that in your prep and see if it makes a difference, because I'm almost certain that something that we mentioned today can unlock just a new ceiling for anyone listening. Any final thoughts there, Jayden?
That was a great wrap up, Ahmed. I hope everybody enjoyed listening, and let us know if there's anything that you'd like to hear more about, because we're always happy to discuss this. These are important principles you'll use throughout your journey in medicine.
And all the best on test day, guys. Like we said, you're able, you've prepared, and ultimately this is going to be validation for the effort that you invested. And so I'm excited for all of you to realize that and to experience that and knock it out of the park, guys. Good luck.
Take care.